So where is offshoring happening so far, and where is it likely to move? And how the government can also articulate, not only articulate these points, but also facilitate this movement, because it will not be random offshoring anymore. It will be friendshoring. So if these countries, the West and Japan and India, are coming together, we should harvest this opportunity for every sector. And medical device components can be more securely made in India and more enduringly made in India than in China.
So I think in the best interest of time, we can begin. Thank you very much, everybody, for taking the time out and joining us here today, especially on a Friday evening. Welcome to the Blue Circle. It's such a big privilege and a pleasure to reconnect with everyone, our distinguished panelists who are handpicked because of the think input and the rich experience that they bring in. And thank you to our distinguished audience for joining us. We've received 150 plus registrations, most of whom are CEOs, CXOs, and senior leaders. Many of them are our members and repeat visitors to our webinars, which is very encouraging and motivates us to provide even higher levels of dialogue to the online channels as well. And for those of you who are new with us today, the Blue Circle is an exclusive community and ecosystem which is curated for business leaders across 6 sectors, which are healthcare, real estate, energy, e-mobility, logistics, and aerospace and defense. We also present socioeconomic insights, which ultimately determine the evolving complexion of the market. In response to the COVID challenge, the Blue Circle has also accentuated its digital presence. One of the many modes we employ is our weekly webinar series in our digital publication. And in addition to this, and you'll be happy to know that we very recently launched the first version of the Blue Circle app, which is curated for leaders, somewhat like the sector-specific LinkedIn for senior leaders, a space to have meaningful conversations, connect with like-minded leaders, house high-quality curated content, and also provide access to business opportunities across these sectors. So those leaders among you who are interested, please do join us. I will share the link to the app in the chat section, and we'll soon be sending out invitations to our new guests post the webinar. We've also begun our selective outreach and have thousands of leaders who've joined the community app already. And today, as part of our Make in India series, we're privileged to have big minds and leading thinkers of the industry join in for the Healthcare Circles discussion. The topic is Roadmap for Making Medical Equipments and Devices in India with the World for the World. In the best interest of time, I will just briefly mention the names and designations of our panelists who are here with us today. We have with us Mr. Amit Chopra, Managing Director, Thermo Fisher Scientific, India and South Asia. Mr. Indranil Mukherjee, Managing Director, Braun Medical India. Mr. Pavan Choudary, CEO, Vygon India, Public Intellectual, Chairman, Medical Technology Association of India, and sits on several boards across the country. And the chair and moderator for the session is Mr. Rahul Guha, Managing Director and Senior Partner, BCG. I now request Mr. Guha to please chair and moderate the session, sir.
Thanks, Siddharth, and what a privilege to have this panel, with me. I think the leading thinkers in medical technology, you don't always get them together on a panel, so it's wonderful, to talk to all of you. And the topic for today is also a very, very exciting one. It's about how can we craft a roadmap for making medical equipment and devices in India. As we know, we have a substantial import dependence in this particular area. And really, what can we do not only to, I would say, be Atmanirbhar, but also, create access for some of the best medical technologies to Indian patients, right? Because it is a balancing act that we need to drive. So with that, actually, what I've done is I have split the panel into 3 themes, and we'll pick each theme as we go up through the discussion. And the first theme is, actually a reflection of the past. And I've looked at, many industries in my consulting career, but when I focus on healthcare, in India, the predominant story and where wealth has got created has been in pharma, right? And we are almost now known as the pharmacy of the world, right? But that is not true in medical equipment and devices. So, I always have this conundrum in my mind. What has been holding us back in this space, right? And maybe my first question I'll push to you, Indranil, and maybe just a word. I know the introduction was very brief, so maybe a couple of words that explain your locus standi, and then just tell us, why do you think medical equipment has just not seen the same success as pharma?
Yeah, so maybe I'll cut through the introduction because I can only say that I have the opportunity to lead the Braun group in India and the healthcare industry for close to 3 decades, of which, let's say, 24 years have been with Braun. So I've been associated with Braun and had quite a fascinating journey from global to region and now back to India. Coming back to your question, I think the fundamental difference is that in case of pharma, this has not happened overnight. It has taken us some time to earn this, let's say, phrase of being the pharmacy of the world. But that apart, when it comes to pharma, again, if we look in terms of pharma, we can broadly categorize it in terms of bulk drugs, APIs, and then the formulations. And when we are talking about India's presence in pharma, we have to also see while as a country, we have really developed our capability more on the formulations, we do continue to face challenge in terms of the bulk drugs and APIs. So that is not that across the entire vertical of pharma, we are doing exceptionally well. That's unfortunately not the case. And in case of pandemic, we have seen that accentuating, right? Now, but as I said, it has taken us some time. And of course, also in the nature of pharma, it is a mix of B2B, but predominantly also B2C and OTC. And that comes in terms of consumption of pharma. So in India, unfortunately, despite regulations and so on, we have a lot of, let's say, consumer habits also spilling over prescription drugs in the OTC space. And that's how pharma has overall also, I'm coming to a point of consumption where pharma has, the consumption has been relatively quite good. And we sometimes have also tend to abuse it because popping up antibiotics now and then, or even if the temperature is moderate, if I may say so, the best thing that we do is immediately pop in a paracetamol, to kind of control the fever and go in for many such kind of analgesics, antipyretics. One example. In case of medical devices, that's not really the case because most of the medical devices from a pure business model comes from a B2B perspective, not so much in the B2C. Of course, now in the B2C, the pandemic has shown pulse oximeters and the conventional low-end ones suddenly mushrooming, if we can say, hand sanitizers and the entire disinfection range. The very low-end one, of course, habits have changed. But by and large, that's one typical difference between medical devices, if I may say so, and pharma. The second is that I think as a country, we have a more of a curative mindset. This is very important to note because when it comes to healthcare, and if we look in terms of all the other, let's say G20 countries or OECD countries, and if we look at the healthcare behavior, there is a good mix of both preventive and a curative behavior. And if we look in terms of the medical devices are also pretty large, right? From consumables to diagnostics, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to the use of these medical devices, in India, the preventive concept is still lacking. And that is one reason where, of course, again, when it comes to consumption, the consumption is pretty much limited. Yes, when it comes to diagnostics, a little bit there on the diagnosis stage, but overall, from a prevention point of view, it is not really there. The second is familiarization of, let's say, the healthcare community in terms of an appropriate usage or using medical devices for intervention. That is also lacking. And when we talk about medical devices, I think the spectrum is very diverse, something from a syringe and a needle at the lowest end to something like a PET scan or a CT scan or a high-end digital equipment and so on. So that's the diversity of it. So first is about the business model. Second is about the consumption habit. If I speak in terms of, let's substantiate this with a little bit of data. The per capita medical device consumption in India is among the lowest in the world. So if I just compare the conventional adjectives of, let's say, BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, China. In 2011, the per capita consumption of medtech in India was close to about $3. And from there, of course, we have definitely evolved. 2019 data is speaking of somewhere about $75. So from 3 to 75, that definitely has been, let's say, a reasonable jump. But if I speak in terms of, let's say, Brazil with a population of roughly about 200, I don't remember exactly, but 215 million or so, has a per capita consumption in medical devices of close to almost about $950. If you look in terms of Russia, which has a population of about 150 million approximately, has a per capita consumption of $900. If we speak in terms of China, which pretty similar to India, 1.4 billion population, the per capita consumption in case of China is also about $420 to $430. So second most populous country in the world, but when it comes to per capita consumption, it's among the lowest, and it is even very, very low. So I think that itself, from a data subset, is a very important indicator which we cannot ignore, that the overall market size, the overall consumption of medical devices in India is subdued, is limited. Can't hear you, Rahul.
Very well put, Indranil. I think if I was to summarize what you're telling is, before you can become a tiger outside, you have to win at home. And if you have to win at home, you need to have at least a jungle that is, and not a cage. So I think wonderful, very well put. I think, and I think many times, when we reflect on this, both from a policy side, and a, just let's say becoming more self-reliant. I think also some of this is predicated. Countries that are a lot more self-reliant also are predicated on the fact that they have a very vibrant domestic industry as well. Because once you win at home, you can win outside. I think.
Absolutely. And that said, that's maybe just before I conclude, this is very important because quite often what we are seeing now is the medical device sector was not really regulated. But thanks to the government, regulations are coming in, the medical device regulation, MDR 2017. We are still waiting for the Medical Device Act to come in. But we have seen in the last 3 to 4 years a conscious effort to make it regulated. And the more that it becomes regulated, the better, because it takes out spurious and substandard quality products and so on. But having said that, one important point, which I think, in case if there are policymakers also attending this, is we can't really copy paste everything in pharma onto medtech. So we have to fundamentally recognize what and how medtech or medical devices, when I say medical devices, the whole spectrum, there are fundamental differences as compared to what we understand as pharma. So that's, I think, one key aspect which we need to factor in policy in terms of all the policies that are being unveiled. And sometimes we see a lot of bit of inconsistency and unpredictability, which becomes a challenge to navigate.
Nice. Thanks for those additional comments, Indranil. Let me move the discussion to Amit now. Amit, we've heard from Indranil, look, why we think there hasn't been so much success. But I want to now, look forward, right? I mean, we all know a Sun Pharma, a Dr. Reddy's, and Lupin, and many of the, the pharma companies that are the bellwethers in the stock market. What will it take to have a Sun Pharma in medtech, Amit? What do you think needs to come together for that?
So thanks for the question, Rahul, and thank you to BlueCircle and Siddharth for the opportunity to join today's discussions. I think just picking on one point that Indranil made, that the pharma industry didn't get where it is, easily. There was a very long period, let's say from the early 80s to the early 2000s, till the time India joined the WTO, when India wasn't part of the WTO, and therefore only process patents were being followed. And in that incubation period of 25 odd years or maybe more, the Indian ingenuity and innovation mindset created phenomenal powerhouses, generic companies, which you see today. And the chemistry competence, the scale, the exports into unregulated markets, all of that became huge. And it multiplied dramatically. I mean, especially in the 90s, I think the growth of the pharma industry was just spectacular. Again, picking up on another point that Indranil made about the per capita consumption, I want to go to the government expenditure on healthcare. And if we think about the government expenditure on healthcare, for example, in China, it is in absolute dollars about 10 times of what it is in India today, right? So I think government expenditure on healthcare as a percentage of GDP is amongst the lowest in India compared to all the countries that Indranil mentioned. And in other, and of course, reimbursement models and the lack of penetration of health insurance so far, all of these things have meant that the macroeconomic factors or regulatory factors which drove pharma, or lack of regulatory factors which drove pharma, those have not been available to the med devices space, right? So the entrepreneurial energies in the country were not unleashed because the country just didn't have enough scale or demand. And there's not enough scale or demand because for a vast majority of the years, our healthcare sector has struggled with just doing the basics, right? To meeting the basic primary healthcare needs across the spectrum. Let's look at what happened in COVID and how an event like COVID can be transformational in the journey of med devices. Prior to COVID, India had 250 labs which were doing molecular diagnostics testing. The molecular diagnostics really is about using, data at the proteomic or genomic level from pathogens and identifying them, right? So techniques like next-gen sequencing or DNA sequencing or RT-PCR, some of these names have become household names now, but they've been fairly niche areas up until COVID struck. I think from March of 2020 to March of 2021, the number of molecular diagnostic labs in the country have grown from 250 to 3,000. And that is scale. India has suddenly become a fairly large market for RT-PCR instruments in the world. And when you think about the sheer volume of COVID kits, testing kits that were sold, the sample prep instruments that were sold, I think what this demonstrated is that an extreme pandemic drove us to build scale, and we had no option. And when we built that scale, we saw immense innovation coming in, right? We saw 118 approved manufacturers in India of COVID testing kits. We've seen millions of kits being produced in the country. Thermo Fisher itself has started producing kits in India because certainly the scale was there. So as the scale evolves, innovation and localization happens. As innovation and localization happens, you will see the emergence of a Sun Pharma or a Lupin or a Biocon in med devices. We have seen that partially being driven by COVID, but COVID is like an unnatural circumstance. But I think it teaches us a lesson that if we do invest in healthcare, if we do, and especially from the government expenditure perspective, if we do drive a higher level of reimbursement and reduce the out-of-pocket expenditure, nature of the Indian healthcare and diagnostics market, as that scale will grow, the demand will grow. As the demand grows, I think Indian entrepreneurs will be absolutely spot on, and so will MNCs be in terms of investing in manufacturing, building scale. And I think once you build scale in India, then it is only a matter of time when we start exporting and start becoming global powerhouses like we've done in pharma. So I think it's a combination of these factors which can drive growth of medical devices in the country. And I'm very pleased that the policy announcements that have come through in the recent 6 months, that there is a real and serious sort of commitment to increase healthcare expenditure. And I think you will see a lot of change in the coming 5 years. If we do follow through on that, we certainly will start seeing a lot of entrepreneurial setups, a lot of MNCs investments, a lot of JVs coming into the med devices area to start localizing, to start producing in India for India, to start right-sizing products that are required in India. And I think that sector will grow then.
Great. Thanks, Amit. What a wonderful parallel. Huh? I mean, the way to think about it and the way you've put it is spot on. I mean, yes, we can say, there is no demand, and then supply will follow demand. But actually here you see it. And I actually, when you mention it now, you actually can see that the kind of investment that has gone into RT-PCR, the number of labs that has been accredited, and all of that is followed demand. So you're right. It's really about, and I think Indranil said exactly the same thing, which was you need to create demand and then the rest will follow. And actually, you've given a very practical example of where that actually happened, right? So that is wonderful. We'll move to Pavan. And Pavan, I just want to hear from you now. Look, we've seen this now, so I'm saying, and the beauty of this is demand need not be at a generic level. Demand can be specific, right? And then addressed that way. So how do you think, some of this we can unlock, right? What role can the government play, Pavan, in this, towards building, learning from what we've heard from Indranil and what we've seen from Amit in terms of COVID, right? Do you have some advice on how we can create, a vibrant sector?
So I think, thank you, Rahul. I think Indranil has brought up the differences between pharma and medtech to an entrepreneur also, and from the market point of view. And Amit has brought in what made pharma successful, as well as the importance of demand growing. Let me bring in the geo-commercial space here. The geo-commercial opportunity, which Amit alluded to, which pharma got, was not bypassing the patent regime, but having an alternate mode to handle the patent regime through process and not through product. Similarly, we are at the cusp where another opportunity is emerging. And we would want the government to catch this opportunity, which I'm sure it is aware of and is getting ready to. The medical device is, that space has now started intervening into geopolitical space, because a medical device can be hacked, or a malware can be put into the medical device, which can hibernate and which can be activated in thousands of medical devices at the switch of a button. So keeping this point in mind, and seeing how the geopolitics is changing, we should see what are the advantages which India brings as an offshoring destination. India with the West has similar democratic system, a shared history of peace, a similar market economy, a similar language, and it is the only country in Asia which can stand up to China, which is now becoming a very strong rival of the West, whether in protecting IPR, etc. So, where is offshoring happening so far, and where is it likely to move? And how the government can also articulate, not only articulate these points, but also facilitate this movement, because it will not be random offshoring anymore. It will be friendshoring. So if these countries, the West and Japan and India, are coming together, we should harvest this opportunity for every sector. And medical device components can be more securely made in India and more enduringly made in India than in China. This is one point. So I hope that just like the previous dispensation, which got the geo-commercial advantage in 1970s for pharma, this dispensation, which is very well informed through our Prime Minister, also catches that. On the regulation and policy piece, also I would like to say that the Prime Minister himself is very keenly involved in medical technology industry and the development of this industry. And he has been asking all departments to do something for the industry. Here is where some problem also comes. The problem which comes is that there are so many, I'm just trying to share the screen. There are so many departments or agencies which regulate this sector that when all of them are asked to do something for the industry, they do not know how to facilitate. Most of them, they know only to regulate. They are bringing more and more regulations, and this is creating turf issues and interagency challenges also. So I'm fully with Amit when he says that the growth is likely to come. The challenge before us is how this growth will be optimal. Are we going to get the maximum growth? And here I would also like to bring in the center state angle in a federal society, which sometimes comes in the way of bringing about optimal growth. For example, if price control comes at the state level also, as it has happened sometimes, or for example, some tariff barriers, menacing tariff barriers are announced, as happened before one budget, that 15 to 20% increase will be coming on medical devices. This was announced by a minister. Actually, it didn't come, and that is really beneficial right now because 80% of the medical devices are imported. And if such barriers will come, the cost of healthcare will go up. But these are certain signals which are not coherent with the opportunity which we are having. Also, I can tell you from MTI, thanks to the work done by MTI, I had the opportunity of meeting the Prime Minister directly. And there is very strong will to do. However, there is little bit dissonance also. For example, one of the global companies was ready to shift from China to India, and they were making all preparations to uproot from there and come here. But before that, only another minister from state announced this. And that announcement created its own negative vibes in the Chinese space as well as in the principal country space. And it did not happen. It was stillborn because of premature announcement. So these things also have to be kept in mind. And lastly, I would like to say that Atmanirbharta is a great goal to have. Atmanirbharta's meaning has to be really defined. Atmanirbharta, I feel, means self-reliance for our sector, medical technology. It means self-reliance in design, self-reliance in manufacturing, self-reliance in training. Because this self-reliance and even self-reliance in healing, because this sector cannot be propelled without making sure that the hospital sector, which accounts for 80% of the total healthcare sector and which this sector depends on, is moving forward. So design, manufacturing, training, as well as healing, all these things, when we are self-reliant in, then the magic will happen, then we will get that optimal growth. This is what my 2 cents are, Rahul.
Thank you, Pavan, and very, very well captured. Maybe at this point, I'll just table. Mr. Sushil Rana has asked a question. I'll leave it open to the panel who would like to take it. But his question was, what would be the practical way to reduce medical device import dependency, which at present is more than 86% in India? I think some elements of that we have touched upon, but if someone would like to kind of consolidate it into, one pointed answer to him, anyone of you would like to take a stab? Indranil, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, so maybe I'll give it an attempt and a try. Yes, it is true that almost while the statistic mentioned is 86%, if I recall, Niti Aayog talking about 80%. But nonetheless, we can't lose ourselves in the numbers. But yes, majority of medtech products are imported in the country. But this is more from in terms of value. So the first thing is understanding the data statistic. It's not about units, it's about value. And that itself is an indicator, or there lies the solution. When we are talking about medtech products or medical device, it is something which is a combination of let's say consumables, equipments and instruments, implants, diagnostics, patient aid, and so on. When it comes to what we could say more in terms of the value piece, the low end, let's say consumables, and where the scale of technology is pretty modest, I would say. There, of course, we have a significant local capability which has built up. So it is not that everything is being imported there. Of course, now we do see challenges which are coming in from especially countries like China, that even in these low-end consumables where we have a significantly enhanced local capacity, there are cost pressures which are coming in, and suddenly this segment is under pressure. But when we look at that value of 80%, that is because when it comes to the higher technology space, that's where it is reliant principally on import, and there hasn't been much of a, let's say, local capability that has been enhanced or developed to that stage. So that is the first thing that one needs to bear in or understand, that what is meant by this kind of a statistic. Now, answering the second question, what needs to be done? So this again, like we have touched upon, Amit also mentioned it, that the development of the pharma industry started from somewhere about mid-80s. And one has to also bear in mind that that is where the DPCO amendment happened in 1988. Good or bad, and together with 1991, as the country opened up, the first phase of liberalization, brought in a lot of reforms, there were a lot of investments. So it didn't happen overnight. There were policy changes which happened. Pricing earlier, it had come to a state where in mid-80s, many pharma companies were about to close operations. if I may say so, because that was the challenge in terms of business was no longer viable. And that was the first remarkable change which happened in the pricing framework. When we are talking about bringing down this reliance, first and foremost is that we need to develop our local capabilities in the so-called technology intensive space. And to build up capabilities there, of course, the PLI scheme is one such example where the government is encouraging investments to come in and that the country reduces its reliance on imports. We build up. So one is that this will take time. But second is that this cannot happen in isolation. It has to happen in sync with also policies. So, I mean, we can come to it later. I won't take much time here, but the current PLI scheme, if we make just a comparison between the PLI on pharma and PLI on medtech, the enthusiasm for PLI in medtech has been rather subdued as compared to the PLI in pharma. And again, we can look at it in details later, but that is an indicator of what tweakings might be necessary in that policy, one. Second is that it's not only about bringing investments or like local entrepreneurs, and the big houses also venturing into this space, but it always needs an ecosystem to thrive. And when I'm talking of an ecosystem, the first ecosystem is about partnership with teaching hospitals and universities and institutes where this technology could be used in a pilot phase to see how it is helping in improving patient outcome. And there is a significant lack of that in the country. We have at the best a handful of such teaching institutes or hospitals where we could do that, limited to some AIIMS and a PGI, a JIPMER, a Sri Chitra, and SGPGI, and so on. So there is a significant lack of an infrastructure or a framework as well to test this out. So again, I just picked out two principal reasons or three principal reasons as to why this won't just happen just because we wish it to. Of course, every country is looking in terms of building up its self-reliance and bringing down import dependency. But it won't happen overnight. It has to come in sync with all these factors together. And the last point which we should also bear in mind is that even many countries where there is, I'll give the example of Germany. Now, Germany is known as exporting many of these medtech products and so on. But at the same time, there is a significantly big share of imports also happening in Germany. There's no country where despite developing so much of capabilities on the medtech manufacturing space, as we may say so, has completely reduced its import dependence. So I think these are some basic fundamentals which we should also bear in mind. And the intent is good, but it cannot happen in isolation. It also needs relook at some of the policies. It needs a relook in terms of the ecosystem. It needs a relook in terms of understanding the whole technology space. And that would be my take at this moment.
Thanks, Indranil. Very well-rounded answer. I think touched upon every dimension of the question, clarifying firstly the definition and then what can we do, and also saying that at the end, even if we do a lot, it doesn't mean that it will become 100%. Completely with you. Let's move to the next question. And Pavan, in your own unique way, right? If I was to ask you, what's the sweet spot for us in India? Where do you think we have unique advantage that we can leverage?
So, in terms of manufacturing, that is where I feel I assume the question is coming from. There are subdomains in which we need expertise: hardware, software, mechanical, and electrical. In the software space, we are strong. Algorithms also we can develop. Apps, we are developing the capability to develop with finesse slowly. But software, we are strong. In the hardware piece, in the chip side, we are not 100% indigenous, but we are not so bad. In the mechanical metallurgy or miniaturization piece, we are not so strong. We usually need Taiwan or France to develop our prototypes. And the electrical side, we are okay. So this is where I feel we are, this is where we stand right now. On the advertising piece, also advertising of products made in India also has to have that class, that reassurance coming through. You have seen in aerospace and defense, the growth rate of exports in the last 2 years is 700%. And one of the reasons for that this industry, which was advertised, let me say, quite not so dexterously by the ordnance factories, etc., was advocated very well by the defense attaches in all the embassies where they felt there was a market for Indian defense exports. And the results are there before you. So we need to indoctrinate and use these platforms which are being used by other industries to speak about our product, and reassuring advertising, good websites which hook the customer at least to try to find out what else is made here. That is another area where we need to work. So this is my short answer to what you asked, Rahul. Hope I have answered your question.
Yes, hardware, software, mechanical, electrical. I think that's a very nice framing of this, Pavan, and and some of the areas around that. Maybe Indranil, I know we touched upon the question I'm going to ask in the in this previous question that you responded to. I wanted to talk about capabilities, right? And as Pavan talked about hardware, software, mechanical, electrical, but I want to take it more broader. I know you used the theme about the ecosystem, right? Just when you think about some of that, what do you think are some of beyond the technical capabilities, right? What are some of the more, I don't want to say softer, but I would say broader capabilities that you might need to build?
So yeah, I think that's also a very pertinent point that first and foremost, when it comes to medtech, we have to also understand that again, it boils down with the first question about consumption and how big is the size, right? Now, the whole piece in terms of countries looking in terms of building more self-reliance is not something which is limited only to India. Across, if I look at the APAC region, whether it's Indonesia, whether it's, of course, China, or whether it's Thailand and Philippines, each and every, Vietnam, there are each and every country coming in with, if I may say so, local protection policies. Now, for a global, any global medtech player, it is not possible to set up, to scale a factory in each and every country in order to be able to tap that market from an opportunity point of view. Because there are two reasons. First is, of course, the issue of scale. And a second and a very important point is that when you look in terms of medtech, what I mentioned in case of pharma, you have the excipients, you have the APIs, and then, of course, you bring them together in terms of process, and then you have a formulation. In case of medtech, as just Pavan mentioned, it's about software, hardware, it is about a lot of components. So that's the first thing when we are talking in terms of an ecosystem. Let's say a reasonably, moderately technology-driven medtech product would have a lot of these components, which would lead a lot of ancillaries to also build up manufacturing capabilities. Just having a medtech factory in isolation wouldn't be able to bring all these pieces together. And that's something which is also very unique in the medtech manufacturing space. And this is what I mentioned earlier. If you look at any of these examples, if you look at Europe, Germany is the powerhouse of Europe. But is Germany the leading medical medtech hub? No, it is Ireland. And not, and why Ireland? It is not only because that Ireland tried to give tax incentives, and that is where many American companies decided to go offshore and save on taxes, and that's why set up in Ireland. That's not really the case. Something like what we have is Invest India, which is facilitating investments into India. There is a government body in Ireland which started this journey almost about 15-20 years back, of this partnership between medtech companies and educational institutions, as well as the hospitals and teaching institutes. First and foremost is relooking in terms of the curriculum, relooking in terms of skill building, apprenticeship, and so on. Again, when we are talking in terms of the medtech space, and there's no dearth of engineers who are passing out of different colleges in India. But as a medtech factory, if I look in terms of skill sets of being gainfully employed, there is a huge gap in terms of skill sets which are available and what is desired. So there's a longer learning curve. That is principally because we have, as a country, not really focused in terms of developing the apprenticeship of apprenticeship model of education, which Germany is very strong. Many countries in Europe have focused a lot. So that is one important aspect to look into. Of course, the government has made the right moves by coming out with Skill India, which the objective was to generate, make people capable in terms of developing those skill sets. But if we look at Skill India as well, again from the original objective and where we are today, there is still a significant gap. And that's where first and foremost is about this apprenticeship education, which needs a change. The ecosystem, as I mentioned, in terms of partnership with these hospitals, teaching institutes, where you try to test technology, that is kind of lacking in India. And just like in the pharma space, when we talk about clinical trials and we say India is because of the vast genotype of population, English-speaking healthcare force, common law system in India, and the normal protection mechanisms which are there, ethical framework, it makes it a very attractive market in pharma for clinical trials. Likewise, in the medtech space, when you try to do a lot of these prototypes and you try to test them out, that is where you need these teaching hospitals and institutions, which is lacking. The ITIs, all these apprenticeships, this is also something which is not so developed in India. The third piece in terms of the ecosystem is also, as Pavan touched upon, the benefits of a democracy, but also some probably disadvantages of the current setup. Health, for example, is a state subject. And that's where the government, both at the center and in the state, need to work in tandem. Wherever this works in tandem, it creates quite a good, facilitates a good framework. Wherever this is at conflict, then it leads to quite some challenges in terms of implementation. So when we are talking of ecosystem, if we first address the ecosystem of availability of manpower, the quality of manpower, then there needs to be a change in the education framework. The apprenticeship model should develop. If we speak in terms of materials as the second part or piece of ecosystem, that is where a lot of ancillary setups also need to thrive around let's say the principal factory. This is what has been the success reason for automobiles in India. 30 years back, the ancillary system was not so well developed. Today, one of the key reasons why the automotive sector in India or even the electronic sector has developed is because of a very strong and a robust ancillary industry also, which is there in addition to the principals. If we speak in terms of the third part of the ecosystem, which is in terms of the general quality of and availability of healthcare workers, we have pretty dismal ratios there. And also in terms of imparting and training their skill sets. Pavan, I think, touched upon one point where he also spoke about Train in India And I can give one example, like in the pandemic, suddenly there has been a spurt of ventilators as the first wave accentuated that need. But today there are many ventilators lying across many hospitals and institutions where the paramedic or the junior and resident doctors are not fully familiar in terms of how to operate. And again, this is where there needs to be a change also in the curriculum of the healthcare workers, which may be a doctor, which may be a nurse, which could be a paramedic, of having the right exposure to understand the diverse spectrum of technology. And in the medtech space, the so-called cycle of innovation is pretty fast. You have to be very agile. You don't have long, I mean, every now and then you have so much of the speed of or pace of innovation is so fast that unless and until you're familiar with that technology, you won't be able to adapt yourself and be able to use that technology in the proper way. So one can go on, but principally if we start addressing them in a piecemeal basis of prioritizing first that these are the first steps which we could address low-hanging fruits, that would make a beginning. And then of course, there are many other things that would follow.
Thanks, Indranil. And actually that was going to push my next question to Amit. Amit, when I listen to Indranil, I'm almost overwhelmed, right? With, how many things need to come together for us to have this sector coming together, right? Elements of the ecosystem, training, capability. And I saw the question from Prabal, which comes back again to the original question around demand, right? So I just wonder, Amit, if we were to, let's just take an example, right? I think COVID, as you talked about molecular testing, and you said, look, COVID taught us that we could do this. I think it's been not 18 months, and we're already doing the highest volume in the world probably in some of these elements. So how can we accelerate this? What can we learn from COVID that can really accelerate that journey? Like we got almost like the jump start that we got in the industry you talked about. What can we do to replicate that?
Right. Thanks, Rahul. So, I'll go back to some of the conversations we've already had. And you talked about the sweet spot and acceleration. I think the one reality of the medtech sector we have to accept, and I think Indranil probably mentioned that, is that when you look at high technology, multinational companies, prefer to have very few selected centers of excellence for the high technology, right? It doesn't make sense to make 3 Tesla MRI machines in every country in Asia. It just won't be profitable. It just won't have scale. You just can't do it. You probably make it in one country at scale, right? When you look at the mid sector, again, you do have emerging technology companies in Asia, but a lot of them have emerged either through reverse engineering or through technology tie-ups. A great example is what has happened in China. I think India is about 10 to 12 years behind China. Today, we are talking of molecular diagnostics using RT-PCR instruments. China has already moved on to producing its own high throughput molecular testing instruments, locally produced, right? And I think that is quite stunning because that's the kind of technology which was in the domain of probably 3 or 4 global big diagnostic players. China already has maybe 3 of those now. I'm sure there's a learning curve and so on. But I think getting technology partnerships, attracting the best technologies to come in, invest, and learn. I think that is an important part of accelerating, a med devices sector in the country. We talked of sweet spot, and let me take 2 examples of sweet spot. A sweet spot has to be driven by market demand, right? If you think about two huge areas in India, one is heart disease, coronary artery disease, and the second one is tuberculosis, right? And this is where you've seen probably the highest level of innovation in the country. You have an Indian diagnostics company which has got WHO approvals to export tuberculosis kits to 35 countries now. That's remarkable, right? And that's developed in India with for both normal and multi-drug resistance TB. And it's not just a kit; it's also with the platform. You have stent manufacturers in India who've spawned up, and quite a bit of them coming into the market even as we speak, looking for venture capital funding and scaling up their operations. So I think a lot of it the sweet spot has to do with the unmet needs and the demand in the country. And whenever those demands have presented themselves, Indian entrepreneurs have responded to it. But if you think about going beyond this into higher technology products, you're going to have to attract technologies into the country. And this is where sometimes we as a country give mixed signals, right? We had an issue with stent pricing. There were perhaps some questionable practices that were happening, but perhaps we went to the other extreme in capping them to a point where the best stents are not available in the country, right? Because it's unprofitable for those companies to sell those stents. So I think you've got to have more uniform policies of attracting investment into the country. When I think from an MNC, when I wear my MNC cap, it is about economics, scale, surety of IP, and the ecosystem of ancillary software, hardware, everything that Pavan and Indranil talked about. But it is also about consistency of policies, about getting the right messaging and signals, and having a good feeling about investing in the country. So I think those are two things which we certainly need to look at. What are the unmet needs today? Very, very small percentage of diagnostic needs for the country are actually being fulfilled. How can we do that as a med devices industry? And as COVID rightly showed us, there was innovation and investment coming in across the value chain for COVID testing, right? Not only in making test kits, but in making components. We had grants coming in from Rockefeller Foundation. We had grants from the DBT. We had huge amount of VC funding coming in, and we had accelerators driving growth of startups, and 118 local companies with approved test kits, which are going to be exported now very shortly. So COVID taught us that scale can be built if you unleash innovation, if you unleash the entrepreneurial energies in the country. If you find the way to fund it, it will happen. But there has to be demand, and there has to be a realization that you can't do this for every technology. You're going to have to choose the areas which the country needs the highest attention to. You're going to have to establish sources of technology, fund innovation, and provide that structure so that startups can and grow and develop, and companies can drive scale.
Great, thanks. And I just have one last question for the panel, and then open it up to Q&A. But maybe I'll start with Pavan. Pavan, paint a picture for me. What does success look like?
So to me, success looks like the government and industry have removing any mist around their glasses. This is first point. So we need to really define very clearly what does self-reliance look like. Taking an example again from the aerospace and defense industry. Why? Because we are the second largest buyer of defense equipment in the world, right after Saudi Arabia. Here, what does self-reliance look like? Will we manufacture all the defense equipment, arms and armaments, missiles, transport equipment, fighter jets, etc., everything here? That is the point which Indranil is making. The spectrum of the product mix is very wide. So we will have to decide what can be manufactured here, easily and quickly, and what will take some more time. So that ladder of what we are going to manufacture here has to be defined. And self-reliance will mean that I can purchase whatever I want at the right rate, at the right time, without any conditions attached. Whether we buy 100% of all the equipment from India or not is a very big moot point. We will not be able to do that because the product lines are very diversified. We can go in for consumables, simple consumables right now. We can go in for some simpler, let me say, less technically complex products right now, and then scale up. So this is one point. Secondly, what Amit said, the consistency in policy also should be evident in our day-to-day experience, which sometimes gets really shaken. For example, in vitro diagnostics, 20% was the increase of custom duties which happened overnight. For example, a preferred purchase order came for in vitro diagnostics, which was in some ways I felt was arbitrary, and because maybe the in vitro diagnostic industry was not organized to present its case coherently. So these are sudden jerks which come, which can be avoided, and success will look like a predictable blueprint to tell us that we have studied the entire sector. These are the products which can be made in India in the next 3 to 5 years. On this, tariff barriers or non-tariff barriers can go up, and this will be the ladder. And on the other products, the which can be made in the next more than 5 years or 10 years, etc., there will be no restrictions right now. This will help us plan our piece better because we are the largest investors in the country. It is the global companies which are having 80% of the market share. It is the global companies which are investing more than 80% in the manufacturing in this sector also. So success, I would say, would look like a predictable and far-sighted view of the sector, and engaging and understanding well how geopolitics is changing, geocommerce is changing, and why these countries can come together and buy in peace, make in peace, and sell in peace predictably. This is what I would like to say.
Great. Predictability I certainly seems to come out. Anything briefly, Amit, or first let me ask Amit and then Indranil. But I think we're almost out of time, so briefly.
So no, I think Pavan has captured it beautifully. I think the roadmap to self-reliance is critical. I think coherent trade policies, regulatory policies, consistency and stability in policies, and a much more nuanced and well-developed PLI scheme will definitely help this industry drive scale. I think I'm super excited when I see the level of entrepreneurial energy that came into localizing for COVID. And I think that just demonstrates that we have it in us to build, to innovate in the country, to drive our costs down. And when we do that, when we do drive our costs down, we can actually capture global markets. Today, test kits in India, for example, sell at a fraction of the price than they sell even in Southeast Asia. And we've not allowed exports of those kits. So we should be getting a lot more of the pharma kind of success in some of these areas if we do allow it. So I think good will look exactly, I fully agree with Pavan, well-defined framework of what we can manufacture in India and how to get there.
Great. And Indranil, you want to wrap us up?
Yeah, I mean, I can only add to what Pavan and Amit mentioned. I think the first thing is to understand that when we are talking about bringing down the import reliance, and medtech is not a labor intensive sector, so making in India does not necessarily give a huge, let's say, cost advantage from manpower, labor. It might be in some other sectors, but that's not how medtech operates or works. Yes, of course, labor is important, but technology here plays a much bigger role. So that's something very important, because when we say make in India, the whole point of make in India, if I had understood it correctly, was because the share of manufacturing to our GDP had significantly come down. And if I'm not mistaken, it is only in the range of 16 to 17%. Services, meanwhile, from an agrarian economy, we have suddenly more than 51% or 55% of the economy coming from services. So that was the idea, that to tackle the issue of employment, and if we want to look in terms of growth and as a powerhouse, then the manufacturing sector needs a big fillip or a push. But medtech sector would not really generate that amount of employment as compared to other sectors. That's one. Second, what Pavan and Amit touched about on the predictability piece here, if I say so, this is something I echoed earlier. We have to look at make in India, make for India, and make from India. It's not all the three prepositions make an impact. When we say make in India, why should somebody come and make in India if there is a bigger kind of a shell that we create around ourselves with protectionism? That protectionism shell does not really help us. That is where, if we really try to embrace and be competitive, what is our sweet spot and success? With that, I will leave. India has always been known for its intellect, and healthcare has been a laggard in terms of adoption of technology, which is changing. The pandemic itself has shown that, and more to come in this decade, that technology will be also a key driver in healthcare. And that is where we have already established our credentials as a country in the field of technology. We are being recognized worldwide, but that cannot be only confined to the IT sector. It is something which can be very well used in driving healthcare as well, and in terms of also addressing another aspect of healthcare, which is accessibility and availability. So technology, this is where, I mean, we can do a lot and we can contribute to the world. That's where we are. I'm talking of make in India, make for India. And when we say make from India, which means we export to the world, then we have to also embrace and adopt global standards and systems. There, if we try to create more and more barriers, then it does not really help in terms of putting or attracting investments. The last piece is, in this whole manufacturing journey, we have to change our lens to understand the importance of research and development. Unless and until we change this approach that R&D has some paltry share, and we relook in terms of what does R&D mean and incentivize that, we don't have any dearth of talent, we don't have any dearth of skill, we don't have any dearth of know-how. So that's where Startup India is a good move. Again, there are a lot of these good initiatives, but they need to scale up. And that is where India can then gain its own, pride in the global healthcare market, which can also benefit us as a country.
Thank you, Indranil. And I think wonderful summary at the end. I think, and that takes me to the question. This is a question from Mr. Sai Kamlesh Raipulu, and he is the co-founder and director of Phonolife Technologies Private Limited. His question, it builds on what you said, Indranil, which is, there are good IP creating startups, but the funding for them is at a snail's pace, right? So is there anything that can be done to, or any thoughts you have to accelerate this?
So I think here I would still give a little bit of credit that there is a lot of work which is happening in terms of Startup India. Yes, I do agree that the pace is still very slow, and across industry forums, we are consistently driving this message. So from MTI, we have always brought about this message in terms of, one area which policymakers need to address. But yes, we can continue to drive this message across to policymakers. If Pavan wants to add anything more, this is what I can think of.
So BIRAC has some schemes. This government has really pushed BIRAC forward, and the funding is, let me say, not enough, but it is higher than ever before. Also, MTI has helped through companies like Medtronic in making startups here take off, like Noka Robotics, a startup which was incubated by IIT Kanpur, was supported by Medical Technology Association of India, and through Medtronic, they could come out with a ventilator which was perhaps the first to meet all the standards. And they got support from their R&D center also in Hyderabad, which has, by the way, where they have invested 1,200 crores just last year. So that is the kind of support the government and the private sector is trying to give for domestic manufacturing and R&D.
Great. Thanks, Pavan. Next question is from Mr. Umanath Nayak, who's the CEO of Decim. And I think I wanted intentionally pick this question because I think all of you would, would love to jump in on this. I mean, Siemens basically is asking what has been the contribution of MNCs in this space after being in India for the last 20 years. And all of you have been here, for the same amount of time. So would one of you like to just take the question head on?
Let me just kick it off. I think Thermo Fisher has been around for a while. We are very proud of the role we have played in the last, of course, for the last 2 decades, but certainly in the last 18 months in the pandemic. Millions and millions of tests have been done, or hundreds of RT-PCR instruments. We have a role. We are playing a role in pretty much every vaccine that's being produced in the world, including the vaccines being produced in India. We are working relentlessly to get our supply chain organized so that our customers in India can get preferential access, even though there's tremendous constraints in global supply chains right now. We have localized kits manufactured in India so that costs can be reduced, and millions of those kits have been sort of sold to Indian customers. So we are very, very proud of the role we've played, and definitely within our industry, our company has the biggest manufacturing footprint in the country. We produced within our industry the highest number of products. That's not only for medtech. There are many other industries we work with, but we certainly have been localizing at a pretty rapid pace, and that will continue.
Thanks, Amit. Just briefly, Pavan, if you want to talk about, would you like to add, and then Indranil?
Yeah, just GE has come out with an ECG machine, basically with Indian audience in mind at a fraction of the cost. It is also developing a similar MRI machine. And Siemens also has done a lot of path-breaking stuff in the healthcare worker training on diagnostic technologies. And more importantly, companies like GE, Thermo Fisher, Philips, Siemens, they have created an ecosystem of manufacturing around them. When Volvo came into the market, it brought to manufacture in India, it bought 200 ancillary companies. Similarly, these companies have created a cradle for that ecosystem of ancillary companies around them. This is a very big contribution. Rahul.
Thank you. Indranil, anything you want to add about your company?
Yes. So like for us in Braun, we have 3, let's say, manufacturing units or factories in India, and of which, one factory is supplying almost 99% of its turnover comes from exports. only 1% from India. So, I mean, that's one. Second is in terms in one of our factories, we have set up our R&D lab is also contributing to the global patent projects. We have come up with some projects where we are also developing that capabilities together with, again, local institutions and engineering colleges that we have done. And we are also working in some breakthrough technology and material science in India. So again, this is what I said, that for us also, in terms of our total turnover from exports, not just of a finished product, but also starting off in terms of R&D and so on, we have already made a beginning. And that is where we can contribute more, but a predictable policy, right framework can only help in accelerating.
Fantastic. And actually, I think with that note, I've gone through the questions. I don't think, there are more clarificatory questions than any new question. And I think we're late on a Friday evening. So I don't know, Siddharth, are you there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Siddharth, would you like to conclude us the session and give a vote of thanks?
Sure, absolutely. Would you like to summarize before that, or I could close then?
No, actually, this last question was a good summary, because we were able to talk. I think we've talked through the entire session in terms of. Let me summarize. Let me do that. I think we've talked through the entire session in terms of, what are some of the challenges? Why aren't we seeing the kind of growth that we expected to see or have seen in other industries? And the panel very articulately clarified, and I think the strong message is you need robust domestic demand to have a robust industry, and therefore policy has to be shaped in that direction. I think then we moved the discussion a lot to capabilities, and both Pavan, Indranil, and then Amit of course came in at the end, talked a lot about how it has to have an ecosystem approach and what to do. And then finally, we talked a little bit about, and I think Pavan articulated the ladder beautifully. And I thought that was a good framing of, how to think about the future. And some of the questions were very pertinent because it allowed us to clarify, many of the issues that might have been on people's minds. For example, will prices fall as a result? And I think Indranil talked a lot about it, that actually, there's not that much competitive advantage from labor cost arbitrage in India. And so, it's a very different game altogether. And then the other question of, what has really been MNC's contributions, right, in India? And I think everyone here who's been here for so many years, if I just reflect on many of our doctors who have learned how to use medical devices, it's actually been through the contribution of many of these organizations who not only brought the products, but rolled up their sleeves and actually worked side by side with doctors and surgeons to help them understand how to use it. And so with that, I thought that was a wonderful note to end on. And with that, with that summary, I'll invite you, Siddharth, to help us conclude.
Thank you very much, sirs. Such an insightful conversation, and an absolute privilege to hear you all, and very well moderated, Mr. Guha. Our leaders and I have been hooked till the end and have taken home several nuggets from today's conversation. I'm still receiving messages from members as we speak, and I really wish we had some more time. And thank you to our leaders in the audience for joining in large numbers and for staying till the end, and for always sharing excellent questions. For the questions that may not have been addressed due to paucity of time, I will share the relevant ones with the leaders on the panel and request some of their time for it. We will also share the relevant questions and answers in the community app as well. So along with our weekly webinars and publication, we're taking these discussions and conversations live on our exclusive community app, which is curated for senior leaders across 6 sectors, which are healthcare, logistics, energy, e-mobility, real estate, and aerospace and defense. So whether you would like to engage with us on our platform, leaders are invited to join the healthcare circle and also get access to the other allied industry circles. So thank you very much, sirs, once again. We look forward to having more such discussions in the future, and please stay safe.
Thank you, Siddharth.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.